Texas territory, late summer of 1879, the sun hung over Calico Ridge like the unblinking eye of a vulture, watching for what it might pick apart next. Heat pressed down so hard the air itself seemed to quiver. In the center of town, the square had turned into a pen for cruelty. Men with dust-crusted boots and whiskey on their breath jostled shoulder to shoulder, eyes fixed on a raised wooden stage. It stood like an altar, but there was no worship here, only the offering of the broken. At its center knelt a girl, barefoot, shackled at the ankle, Isa. No one had asked her name, no one cared to. Her dress, once white, clung in tatters, smoke-stained, streaked with rust-colored blood that hadn't yet fully dry. The air smelled of sweat and old timber, but around her was the sharper tang of iron. In her arms, a newborn whimpered, lips puckering weakly against her chest. The child's skin was red and damp, too new for this world, far too new for this place. An iron chain bit into Isa's ankle, bolted to the post like she was livestock. Her knees trembled, but she held her head just high enough to hide the tremor in her jaw. The auctioneer, tall black vest glinting with tarnished buttons, grinned wide enough to show every yellow tooth. "Step right up," he called, voice cracking the air. "2 for 1. Young enough to mend. Comes with a squealer to grow your legacy." Laughter rippled through the crowd like a snake uncoiling. "Still bleedin'," a man jeered. "Fresh as spring calf," the auctioneer agreed. "Ain't every day you get to name a babe you didn't father." Bids started low, a cruel mockery of value, but rose fast, heat shimmering over the crowd as men shouted numbers like they were tossing dice. 50 seemed to 100. Isa's pulse pounded louder than the voices. Then a pause. A voice cut through the din. Calm. Gravel-edged. 300. Silence slammed over the square. Heads turned. At the edge of the crowd stood a man in a faded duster, wide-brimmed hat, shadowing his eyes. Boots worn, coat dusty, unremarkable, except for the stillness about him, the kind of stillness that made you notice. The auctioneer squinted. 300? "Sir, you hear—" "I heard," the man said, stepping forward, "and I'm here to give her a bed. Let her sleep." The crowd murmured, some laughing, some staring, but no one topped his price. The gavel fell. The gavel's echo hadn't yet died when the man stepped onto the stage. The crowd shifted, boots grinding in the dust, necks craning to see what he'd do. Isa didn't look up, not until she heard the metallic scrape of steel against steel. The chain at her ankle fell away with a final heavy clank. He extended a calloused hand. She stared at it, suspicion sharp in her eyes. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Sleep," he said. "Then we'll talk like people." Isa rose on unsteady legs, clutching the child tighter. The baby whimpered, his small face pressed to her neck. The man Jack Morrell glanced at the child, then back to her. "You got a name?" She hesitated. "Isa." Jack nodded once, then turned to the crowd, still watching like they expected a show to go on. He rested his palm on the revolver at his hip, not drawing, just reminding them it was there. "Anyone want to top my bid?" No one answered. The silence was thick as old rope. Jack touched the small of Isa's back, guiding her down the steps. They crossed the square without a word. Men's eyes followed, but none stepped forward. The road from town wound through cedar-brushed hills and dry gullies, where dust rose behind the horses' hooves. Jack rode ahead, leading a spare mount for Isa. She sat rigid in the saddle, every creak of leather making her grip the reins tighter. The baby stirred fitfully against her chest, and she hummed a low, tuneless sound to keep him quiet. Twilight bled into the hills, coyotes calling from somewhere beyond sight. Jack said little, only glancing back to be sure she was still there. At last, the trail dipped into a shallow valley. A small corral, a weathered barn, and a squat house stood against the last wash of daylight. Jack dismounted and led her around the back. Beside the stable stood a narrow side cabin, one window, one door, smoke curling faintly from a stovepipe. He pushed the door open. Inside, a cot with clean sheets waited, a cradle beside it. A folded blanket lay neatly at the foot. The air smelled faintly of cedar and wood smoke. "This is yours," Jack said simply. Isa stepped inside like someone expecting a trap. She scanned the corners, the rafters, the small table against the wall. Jack set a kettle on the stove and placed a bowl of oatmeal beside the cradle. "I'll be back in the morning," he said. "You need rest. The boy needs a mother who isn't looking over her shoulder." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "If you try to touch me, I'll slit your throat in your sleep." Jack didn't flinch. "That's fair." He left without another word, closing the door behind him. Isa fed the baby from the bottle he'd left, swaddled him tighter, then slid a small knife from under the blanket and hid it beneath her pillow. She lay back on the cot, eyes open to the darkness. The night held only silence, no footsteps, no locks turning, just the slow crackle of embers in the stove. When morning came, the first thing she saw was a square of white cloth on the cradle's edge, frayed at the corners, embroidered with tiny bluebirds. She touched it, uncertain. Jack knocked once before entering, setting down a bottle of warm milk and a jar of mashed apples. He nodded toward the cloth. "My mother made that for my baby's sister. She died that winter." "Why give it to me?" "Because your child deserves more than chains and dirt floors." Jack placed a bundle of small clothes on the table, patched but clean. "I'll be back by dusk," he said. "Why are you doing this?" Isa asked. Jack's answer was quiet. "Because no one ever asked you how you wanted to live." Her grip tightened on the knife hidden beneath her thigh. "And if I don't know?" "Then you start with sleep," he said, stepping out into the sunlight. This time, she watched him go. And when the door closed, Isa sat on the cot, placed the baby against her heart, and let her eyes drift half shut, not surrendering, but resting. Days slipped by like slow-moving clouds. Isa rarely left the cabin except to fetch water or hang the baby's clothes. Jack kept his distance. Each morning, he left bread and milk on the step, sometimes a blanket, sometimes a book with pressed flowers between the pages. He asked for nothing, spoke only what was necessary. The baby Samuel, she began to call him silently, grew stronger. Sometimes Isa sang under her breath when she thought no one was near, and still she never gave her full name. The townsfolk kept their distance, muttering, "The girl from the auction," or worse. They stared at the scar on her ankle like it was a brand, but Jack called her something else. "Morning, Miss Isa," he'd said once, tipping his hat as she hauled a bucket from the well. She'd frozen, the rope burning her palm. "What did you say?" "Your name," he answered simply. "I reckon you have one?" "No one's ever said it like that," she murmured. "That seems wrong," Jack said, walking away. 3 nights later, thunder came not from the sky but from hooves. 4 riders pounded through the ranch gates. Isa recognized one from the square, the man who'd laughed when blood soaked the boards beneath her knees. Jack stepped out of the barn, shotgun in hand, calm, as if greeting old neighbors. "We're here for what's ours," the lead rider said. "This is private land," Jack replied. "She's stolen property." The man shot back. "Flesh. Warrant registry still got her name." "She was bleeding through her clothes when I paid for her," Jack said. "I paid outright," the man smirked. "Maybe we refund you, call it even." Jack stepped closer. "At this ranch, property doesn't breathe. That girl has lungs and a name." One of the riders touched the butt of his pistol. "You making this legal?" "I'm making it human," Jack said. A long silence. Then the lead rider spat in the dust. "Not worth it." They turned their horses and rode out. Isa stepped from behind the stable door. "You could have been shot." "So could you," Jack said evenly. "What if they come back?" she asked. Then they'll remember what kind of man lives here. Jack studied her for a long moment. Miss Isa, unless you want me to call you something else? Her voice was steadier now. No, it was never the name I hated, just the way it was said. And for the first time, she gave it in full. Isa Lorene. Jack nodded once. Pleasure to meet you proper, Miss Lorene. The wind that night carried the faint scent of dust and danger. Isa lay curled on the cot, Samuel's small breaths warm against her collarbone. Sleep finally took her, but it dragged her back to the straw, to the weight of blood pooling beneath her, to laughter that cut sharper than any blade. She woke gasping, clutching Samuel so tightly he whimpered. Through the cabin's small window, a single lamp burned outside. Jack sat in an old chair, coat draped over his shoulders, hat in his lap. He didn't look away when she stepped into the doorway. Bad dream, he asked. She didn't answer. He rose slowly, picked up a tin mug from the table beside him, and offered it. Steam curled from its rim lavender, chamomile, something earthy. She wrapped both hands around it, letting the heat seep into her fingers. No one's going to touch you again, Isa, Jack said. How can you promise that? I don't promise, he replied. I keep watch. He sat again, his gaze steady, the silence between them almost warm. After a while, he nodded toward the sky. See that crooked line of stars? Been following the one on the left since I was 13. And it hasn't led you anywhere? She asked. It led me here, he said simply. She looked at him, then really looked, and found no softness, only steadiness, the kind you could lean on if you dared. That night, for the first time in years, she slept without waking. Weeks passed. Isa began rising with the dawn, walking barefoot into the dirt yard with Samuel in a sling. She learned to keep the fire alive through high wind, to mend fences with steady hands. Sometimes she even smiled when no one was watching. One afternoon, Jack returned from town to find her hoeing weeds near the stable. You don't have to work, he said. I don't want to sleep forever, she replied. He watched her for a long moment. My sister's name was Laura, he said at last. She was 12 when a man offered my father money to take her east. Promised schooling. I was 18. Waited too long. By the time I found her trail, she was already gone. Isa stood still, letting his words hang in the air. She ended up in one of those auction towns. All I found was her necklace, tossed in a drawer like trash. There was no breaking in his voice, only a quiet that felt heavier than shouting. That evening, while Jack was fixing a stall hinge, the ladder shifted and crashed. Isa came running, Samuel on her hip. Jack was on the ground, a deep gash across his forearm. You're supposed to be smart, she scolded. Not today, he muttered. She dragged him to the porch, cleaned the wound, and stitched it with precise hands. You're not afraid, he said quietly. I am, she whispered, but not of you. When she tied the cloth tight around his arm, her hand lingered over his heartbeat, steady, warm, real. If I can't trust men, she said, I still want to trust you. Jack didn't speak. He only held her gaze until the baby stirred, breaking the moment. Dusk rolled in on quiet hooves and a mean smile. 4 riders came up the lane, dust hanging behind them like a torn flag. The first to dismount wore a fine gray coat and rings that flashed city shine on prairie rot. He looked past the corral, past the house, straight at the narrow cabin where a lamp burned low. Aren't you hard to find, Miss Lorene, he drawled, like he already owned the breath in her throat. Jack stepped between the man and the door before Isa could rise. She's not yours, he said. She is by contract, the stranger snapped, producing a folded paper like a badge. Auction was irregular. That makes her unpaid property. $300 or the girl comes back. She was bleeding from childbirth when you chained her, Jack said. There's no fairness in that paper. The man smiled with one side of his mouth. Fairness is for sermons. I'm here for settlement. The riders fanned, hands drifting toward polished grips. Isa stood behind the screen, Samuel tucked to her shoulder, every muscle ready to flee and unable to. The lamp beside the cradle hissed in the draught. You paid, the man went on. Good for you. But the sale was void. Either refund me or I reclaim what's mine. Jack's jaw tightened. At this ranch, nothing that breathes is property. A silence followed, thin, dangerous. Out on the flats, a coyote called and did not wait for an answer. The stranger's eyes slid to Jack's hip. Well then, we can let iron settle it. Jack stepped forward, the boards underfoot complaining. High noon, he said. In the square. You bring your gun. I'll bring mine. A murmur ran through the riders. The man in gray tilted his head, savoring the taste of it. Tomorrow, then. They wheeled their horses and left the way they came, quiet, efficient, like a bad idea that knew it would return. Jack stood until the dust thinned. Only then did Isa open the door. You shouldn't have agreed, she said. I've seen men die for less. So have I, Jack answered. He looked at the paper fluttering in the dirt. Some prices you pay once, or you pay forever. That night the house held its breath. Jack sat and oiled his revolver with the care of a man polishing a headstone. Isa laid Samuel down and watched the lamp flame swim in glass. After midnight she spoke without turning. If you fall, they'll come for us. If I fall, Jack said, you run. Take the back trail to the dry wash. Church ruin 2 miles east. Hide till dark, then head north. And if you don't fall, then we stop being prey, he said, and we start building something no paper can sell. She listened to the wind scuff the porch and the coyotes sing it back. For the first time since the square, she reached across the table and set her fingers over his knuckles. No promise, no plea, just a touch that understood tomorrow. The sun over Calico Ridge burned white at its center, flattening every shadow to a blade. The street was empty except for 2 figures, Jack on one end, the man in gray on the other. Doors were shut tight, curtains drawn, children kept inside. Dust clung to the air like breath before a scream. Jack's sleeves were rolled, the butt of his Colt worn smooth from years of use. Across the way, the stranger's pearl-handled pistol caught the light, almost too pretty for killing. The sheriff stepped forward, eyes darting between them. On my count, he said, voice thin against the heat. From the edge of an alley, Isa watched. Samuel cradled close, her heart drumming so loud she barely heard the numbers. 3. Both men moved. 2 shots cracked, so close together the sound seemed one. The stranger's bullet split a board behind Jack. Jack's shot hit clean through the man's shoulder, spinning him sideways into the dust. Gasps spilled from the doorways. The stranger's pistol fell, useless. Jack walked forward, the street, swallowing the sound of his boots. He reloaded slow, eyes never leaving the man writhing at his feet. Men don't buy lives, Jack said, and I don't shoot to prove I can. He holstered the Colt and walked away before the sheriff reached them. Behind him, Isa's breath broke free, half relief, half disbelief. That evening, the sky turned copper over the ridge. Isa was boiling water when the fever struck. It came sudden, her knees buckling, the pot tipping dangerously. Jack caught her before she hit the floor, feeling the heat of her skin through his shirt. He carried her to the bed, tucked the blanket to her chin. Through the night he moved between her and Samuel, feeding the boy, cooling her brow, changing the basin when the water warmed. 3 nights passed in the dim rhythm of sickness, Jack's hand steady on her wrist, his voice low in the dark. On the 4th morning, Isa woke to find him asleep on the floor, Samuel curled in the crook of his arm. Her voice was weak. Why didn't you send me away? Jack blinked himself awake, meeting her eyes. Because you never needed saving. You just needed time. Her throat tightened around words she didn't know how to say. She reached for his hand instead. His fingers closed over hers, and for a moment the room was quieter than it had any right to be. By spring, the frost broke at last. Isa's steps grew stronger, her laughter rare, but unguarded. Samuel rode on her back while she mended fence posts. The house smelled of fresh bread and soap, not fear. One morning she stood by the fence, looking toward the hills. "There are others," she said. Jack didn't ask who. "Girls like me," she added, still bleeding one way or another. "What do you want to do?" She turned to him, eyes steady. "Open the back room. Fix the roof. Put in a stove. For them. For us." By midsummer, the room stood ready, new planks nailed tight, walls painted a pale sky blue, an iron bed frame traded for eggs, old quilts softened by years of other stories. Word traveled the way it always did in small towns, quiet at first, then faster than wind across wheat. The first girl came with a split lip and a bundle she wouldn't open. She kept to herself for days, flinching at the sound of boots on the porch. Isa gave her space, a cup of tea, and the same bed every night. Another arrived barefoot, clutching a Bible too tight to read. She wept only once over a basin of warm water, as Isa combed the knots from her hair. No questions, no bargains. Only the kind of shelter that didn't ask for anything back. Isa taught them small things first: how to hold a child without fear, how to cook rice without burning it, how to look a man in the eyes and not bow your head. Then, one fog-thick morning, Isa found a bundle swaddled in torn cotton on the barn's front step. A newborn, pink and crying, her fists no bigger than acorns. Pinned to the blanket was a tobacco slip, a single name scratched in charcoal. Isa knelt, lifted the baby to her chest, and breathed in the scent of river clay. "She can't be more than a day old," she whispered when Jack came running. "Someone just left her?" he asked. Isa nodded, her eyes red but steady. "She sleeps inside tonight. She'll be warm." That evening, under the lantern's glow, she sat at the table with Samuel in one arm and the foundling in the other. Jack dried the last dish and turned toward her. "I don't have a ring," he said quietly. "Not much land either, but I've got a name. If you want it, it's yours." She looked up, breath catching. "You don't need to give me anything." "I want to," he said. Isa rose slowly, crossing the room until her hand rested on his chest. "I was sold once," she murmured. "This time, I choose." Jack's fingers brushed her cheek. "So that's a yes?" She nodded. "I'll take your name, but not just to live, to build something with you." Behind them, both children slept, one in a cradle, the other in a basket near the fire. In that quiet, where once there had been only survival, the first bricks of something unshakable were laid. 2 years later, the Morel homestead didn't look larger so much as fuller. The vegetable rows stretched farther, winding between small wooden playpens and the clatter of clotheslines. The barn's siding gleamed with fresh paint. Behind the main house, a second bunkhouse, stood pine boards weathered to honey, a sign over the door carved with 2 words, "Rest here." Some who came stayed days, some months, a few years, all left with something they hadn't arrived with their own name, spoken without fear. Inside, Isa kept a journal. She wrote at a small desk by lantern light after the children were asleep. The air was never entirely silent. Peace here had its own sounds, murmurs from the bunkhouse, the creak of a rocker, a kettle sighing on the stove. On one page she wrote, "This is a place where women sleep without fear." Sometimes she would pause mid-sentence to watch from the window. Out in the paddock, Jack knelt beside their daughter Sparrow, showing her how to hold reins without letting them bite into her palms. Sparrow's boots swung above the stirrups, as Jack lifted her into the saddle, her laughter scattering across the yard. Isa would smile, then turn back to the page. One autumn afternoon, Sparrow sat in her lap, tracing the ridge of skin around Isa's ankle. "What's that?" the girl asked. "A lock," Isa said softly, "from someone who forgot I was a person." Sparrow frowned, tiny fingers curling. "That's silly." "Yes," Isa murmured, "it was." "No one will lock you again," Sparrow said with the certainty only children have. Isa kissed her daughter's hand. "No, baby, not ever again." That same season, a new girl arrived barefoot, her lips split, her dress so thin it clung like paper. Isa met her at the fence. "You here to stay or to rest?" The girl's eyes darted once over her shoulder. "I don't know." "Then stay until you do," Isa said, leading her inside to tea and the quiet company of the front room. That night, the girl slept 12 hours straight. Isa wrote in her journal again, "We do not save them. We give them a place to remember who they are." Jack never asked to be called a hero, though the name began to follow him through town. He'd shrug, saying he only owned some land and knew how to swing a hammer, but Isa saw the truth in the way folks' shoulders eased when he walked by. He had built more than fences, he had built a way forward. One evening they sat beneath the stars on the back porch, the scent of mesquite drifting from the embers in the pit. Lanterns swung gently from poles across the yard where children chased each other, their laughter tangled in the night air. "You ever think about the auction?" Jack asked quietly. Isa's gaze stayed on the children. "Not like before." "How so?" "I used to hear the gavel in my sleep," she said. "Now I hear Sparrow laughing instead." Jack turned to her, eyes catching the starlight. "I love you." Her head found his shoulder like it belonged there. "I know." In her journal later she wrote, "I was once bought for less than a horse, but I was loved like a human. That is the only price that ever mattered." The weeks that followed were busy repairs before the first frost, a mare foaling early, the constant rhythm of new arrivals at the bunkhouse. Isa moved through it all with a steadiness born from years of holding herself together, but now it was matched by something gentler, trust. One wind-bitten morning, Sparrow came running from the barn, breath puffing white. "Mama, someone's here!" Isa found a young woman at the gate, shoulders squared in defiance, though her eyes held more exhaustion than challenge. She carried nothing but a small satchel and the stubborn pride of someone who'd had to survive too long on her own. "Are you Isa Lorene?" she asked. "Yes," Isa replied. "They said you'd take me in." Isa studied her for a moment, then unlatched the gate. "Come warm yourself," she said. Inside, the girl hesitated at the sight of the fire. Isa remembered the first night she'd stood in this room, her own muscles locked from expecting the worst. She set a bowl of stew on the table and waited until the girl's hands wrapped around the spoon before speaking again. "Here, no one asks where you've been unless you want to tell it." The girl's shoulders sagged, a single tear carving down her cheek. That night, the new girl slept in the back room with the stove burning low, her satchel folded neatly at the foot of the bed. Isa stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the slow rise and fall of the blanket. She remembered the first time she'd slept here, how every sound had been a threat, until it wasn't. Jack found her there, leaning on the frame. "She'll be all right," he said. "I know," Isa replied, "but it's the in-between that's hardest." Winter came hard that year, snow lying thick against the eaves, frost lacing every window pane. Yet inside the Morell homestead, the air stayed warm, thick, with the scent of bread, stew, and wood smoke. The bunkhouse filled, emptied, and filled again. Isa kept a ledger by the door, each name written carefully in her slanted script. Some were crossed out when the women left, not as a loss, but as proof they had somewhere to go. One late afternoon, she stepped onto the porch, Samuel tugging at her skirt, Sparrow chasing after him. The sun was low, staining the snowfields copper. Jack was mending a rail near the gate, his breath visible in the cold. She walked to him, tucked her hands into his coat pockets, and stood there, letting the wind whistle past. You ever think, she asked, how different it could have been? Jack's hands closed over hers inside the fabric. Every day. That's why I don't waste the one we've got. She smiled faintly, leaning her forehead to his chest. The weight of the years before him was still there, but it no longer crushed, only reminded her how far she had come. That evening, Isa wrote in her journal once more, "We are not just surviving. We are planting roots in a land that once tried to bury us." When she closed the book, the children were already at the table, cheeks pink from the cold, the stew steaming. Jack took his seat beside her, brushing snow from his shoulders. Outside, the night pressed in, but the house did not yield. The years ahead would carry their own storms, dry seasons that cracked the earth, tempers in town that flared hotter than July sun, old enemies passing through with eyes that remembered too much. But the Morel place stood through them all, not because the land was rich or the fences strong, but because of the quiet promise that had taken root there. Isa knew that mercy, once given, had a way of multiplying. The bunkhouse door never closed to the ones who arrived in the dead of night, clutching nothing but their own name. Some stayed long enough to heal, some left after a single meal, but all crossed the threshold lighter than when they came. She often thought of the stage in Calico Ridge, the boards slick with heat and dust, the gavel echoing through her bones. That memory no longer hollowed her out. It was the shadow that proved the light existed. Without it, she might never have known the worth of what she held now. One spring morning, Sparrow asked why so many people came to stay. Isa smiled, brushing the hair from her daughter's brow. "Because there's more than one kind of orphan," she said. "Some lose their families, some lose themselves. We help them find their way back." Jack listened from the porch, the brim of his hat low over his eyes. He didn't speak, didn't need to. His hand rested over hers when she joined him, the silence between them as steady as the land beneath their boots. Isa's journal would one day be found in the drawer beside her bed, pages yellowed, corners softened. On the last page, in writing firm and unshaken, she had left a single line. "I was bought once, but I was never owned. Love is the only claim worth keeping." The homestead would outlive them both, weathering years and carrying stories in its walls. And somewhere in Calico Ridge, folks still told the tale, not of the auction, not of the duel, but of the man who bought a girl only to give her a bed, and the woman who turned that mercy into a home for anyone who needed one. Because in the Old West, not every hero rode in with a badge or a bullet. Some simply stood their ground, and when they saw a soul in chains, offered a hand instead of a price.